All right, everybody, thanks for coming. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So yeah, really appreciate the great turnout today. I'm hoping to do more of these connect and learn sessions, as I'm calling them, as part of the aquaculture information exchange, as a way to, connect everybody on there, but also give people opportunities to talk about their work. And so today we have Mike Blakeley. He's the co-founder of Seagreen Insights, and they recently published a report on marketing seaweed, specifically in the US. Um, and I know that that's a topic that we see discussed a lot on our website. And just really quick before I hand it over to him, I'll be sending out a survey to you all after this session. Just will be a few questions, just as a way for me to, figure out what's good about these sessions, what could be improved. But yeah, I would appreciate if y'all responded to those. But with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks so much for joining. Again, my name is Mike Blakeley, and I'm the co-founder of Seagreen Insights. We're a nonprofit based here in California. And I'll talk just real quickly about who I am and what the organization does before I jump into the topic of our report today. So I actually started my career in the seafood industry. I spent about 8 years mostly working with sourcing from factories overseas. I actually had my own company for a while, and I serviced clients in Japan, Europe, and the US. So this idea of extracting a resource from the ocean, processing it, getting it on store shelves or in restaurants is very familiar to me. I founded Seagreen Insights last year after doing a deep dive into the seaweed sector, and looking possibly at investing myself in companies that were producing products. And in that effort, which included, digesting just tons of reports and talking with various people in the industry, a couple of things jumped out to me and my co-founder. Number one is that this is still such a young industry that if you look from the 20,000-foot view of the industry, there's a lot of different pieces that still need to be built out, as you all might agree, right? And I'm not just talking in the supply chain, but even when you get to support organizations, some of the work that you all are doing at Sea Grant, to trade associations, all that type of infrastructure that helps industries grow is something that's coming on stream slowly here in the US and maybe even a little more so in Europe, but still definitely needed if we want to see growth of the sector. The other thing that we found in diving into a lot of reports on consumers is that there still is, it's clear that there's low awareness of seaweed as a consumer item, what application that you're talking about. But even anecdotally, I'm here in the Bay Area, which you could call a foodie-centric location, talking to people about seaweed simply as a food product, forget about the other applications. There's just not a lot of knowledge, in fact, even a bit of an aversion to it. And so my co-founder and I, we took a step back and said, look, it's clear that the industry wants to grow, needs to grow, has an opportunity to grow. But until you can sort of bridge that gap where consumers have a better understanding of seaweed as a biomass and its potential, I think you're going to need to see, there's not going to be as much of the market pull or the demand side that needs to sort of accompany the inputs that we know the supply side needs. And so we decided to found this nonprofit and really focus on the market pull and the demand side. And our overall, our mission statement is that we want to accelerate investment and innovation in the sector by raising consumer awareness. So that's really where our nonprofit is focused. It's what we saw as a gap right now as the industry grows, and we hope to fill that gap. I should also note that I spent several years doing strategy consulting, working with industries all across the world in terms of their growth, whether it was agriculture, tourism. And so bringing that insight into how the US and other global seaweed sectors look to grow is something that we're really excited about doing. So that's who I am and what we're doing. And our first activity was to launch a report on what is actually working in terms of driving sales of seaweed products in the US. So I'm going to put up my screen here and go through that report with all of you. All right, can everybody see that okay? So
Yep, looks
why did
good.
we, well, let me see if I can get to here. Hopefully that's better. And okay. So our report is titled Lessons Learned, Marketing Seaweed Products in the US. And why did we do this report? So what we found in a pretty extensive literature review is that there's a lot of information on consumer attitudes and perceptions, even some employment of willingness to purchase models, which of course is useful data, but none of it is really capturing what is translated into an actual sale and movement of the product, right? They're all sort of hypothetical. Would you buy seaweed if X, right? And so we figured that there's been enough of a track record of sales of products in the US market to actually start capturing what has been working, what has proved effective from a marketing perspective, what are consumers saying about the product right now, and to really add to the body of research by now looking at the sort of actual versus the hypothetical. The audience for this is really intended to be everything from entrepreneurs and startups that are just sort of making their way into the US market or thinking about developing it, as well as the investors that are backing those companies, but also support organizations like Sea Grant and like others that are dedicated to the growth of the sector, but are wondering maybe where some of their interventions and investments might be best placed. And as you'll see at the end of this, we make the argument that even though we did a study that we funded on our own, we think more money needs to go into actual activities versus sort of the research side. But that's up for debate. We can talk about that later. And then finally, why the US market? Well, having served most major markets in the world, I can tell you that there is no market more competitive than the US. And so I have that mantra that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. So it's a great test case to look at what is actually working here, because consumers, this is such a consumer-driven economy, as many of you know, and seeing what is actually working here from a marketing perspective, I think can actually probably help some of the other markets like Europe and other advanced economy markets. So the methodology in our study is pretty straightforward. Most of the data, qualitative data, relies on interviews. We interviewed, I think, about 28 different companies and individuals in this relatively small sample size, but again, in the US sector, it's not that big. And these folks were kind enough to give us their time and their input, and it's robust enough to where the point where we started seeing redundancy in the responses and started to be able to make statements about things based on our interviews. We also, as I mentioned, did a literature review. We digested everything we could get our hands on as it related to looking at consumers and looking at US market trends, et cetera. And then finally, we did launch a survey. It was it only had 5 questions. We wanted it to be quick and easy. At the end of the day, the survey responses weren't really that revealing. You can see them at the end of the study. They didn't nearly add to the findings as much as the interviews did. But anyway, this is a standard approach to doing this type of study that you would all be familiar with, just to share that. So we had a ton of information, and hopefully everybody can see that. I'm going to try to move this. Essentially, after we had all of the information and data, we organized it under 6 themes, which you can see here. And they're all pretty unique, although some of the responses and some of the findings are, they go across the different areas. But I'm going to be presenting the findings, relatively quickly in these areas here, and that's how the report is organized. And, Joe, I have a lot of content on my slides. If it's okay with you, I'll present one of these sections, and then maybe I'll ask if people have questions. That way we can avoid a ton of questions at the end. Is that all right?
Sounds great to me. Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's start with this issue of what do we call it? This was by far the biggest issue that people wanted to talk about. And as you can imagine, very personal to all of these producers. I can say clearly there was no consensus among these producers of what we should be calling seaweed or seaweed-based products. And people felt very strongly that what they were referring to their product, whether it was kelp or seaweed or a specific variety, they felt very strongly that that's what they had to do. And in fact, what was interesting is the word seaweed itself was pretty controversial. Some people felt that seaweed has this reputation of something that washes up on the shore. It's rancid. Why would you ever want to eat it or put it on your face in a cosmetic? Others said, hey, look, there's enough products in the market right now, especially for the millennial or Gen Z buyers, that they'd be familiar with seaweed as a nutritious and good tasting product. So seaweed is what we should call it for now and for the future. There was a real strong feeling about referring to your product as farmed or wild. And that's one of those things that sort of crosses the areas that these 6 areas that we focused in. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when it came to just naming it on packaging or even in, bulk, differentiating between a wild or a farmed product is critical. And you're going to see evidence of that later on. Of course, a lot of people use the common name, especially when you're talking about selling it dried. So whether it's kelp or kombu, wakame, etc., people felt you absolutely have to refer to whatever species it is. But then also people were really keen on this term sea vegetables, which is what they called in Japan and in some other markets. And some people just felt strongly that is what it is, and that's how it needs to be marketed. Seaweed, of course, is a name that's still used. And then as you can see here, people are doing wordplay. So vitamin C, sea fiber in the case of textiles. There's a company doing a product called chicharrones, which is a play on the product actually is developed like chicharrones, the fried pork rind snack food. So really all over the board in terms of what to call it. But when I talk to people about this report, the first thing they want to know is, well, what does everybody say they call her? How should we be referring to seaweed to make it the most effective marketing? Unfortunately, there isn't really a singular takeaway here. It's very individual to the producer. Any questions on that section right there before I move on? Okay, I can't see your screen. So Joe, can you moderate that part for me?
Yes. Yeah. If people have questions, you can either raise your hand or put the question in the chat and I'll monitor it.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. So the next thing, and really the heart of this report, where we got the most feedback, is what people felt were the most successful marketing messages, right? So for their external audience, what seems to resonate the most? Origin is extremely important. And here in the US market, we're seeing more US-based product, US farmed, cultivated product coming on the market. And so for those producers that are working exclusively with US-based product, they thought that it was critical that they noted that it was a local or at least a domestic product and not something imported. There are other producers we talked to that are working with imported products, and they felt it equally important to note this is imported and to play that up because some of the areas they were sourcing from, for example, in the North Atlantic, or in one case, a wild harvest product from Spain, they absolutely felt it was important to say this is imported from those waters with these characteristics, right? So the origin is extremely important. I think what we are seeing, Seagreen Insights, when we look more broadly at the market, is that the health and nutrition aspects of seaweed seem to be the most notable and successful characteristics to market. We all know that consumers, regardless of food, pet food, cosmetics, they're all growing more and more concerned about what's in their products and where it's coming from. So the sort of health and nutrition benefits of seaweed, which are excellent, we all know, seem to be the strongest marketing message of the producers that we spoke to. Interestingly enough, climate impact. So those of you that were following COP28, or those of you that might already be in the climate space, seaweed's potential contributions to things like carbon sequestration, and other just regenerative farming, all of these types of things that play into the climate narrative, those did not come out as being very strong messages by producers. They acknowledged it, but they felt that their consumers or their customer base wasn't as concerned with that as other things. The other major thing, particularly when you're looking for seaweed, a seaweed derivative that goes into another product like cosmetics in particular, or biostimulants, is this idea of efficacy and performance. So where seaweed is a superior alternative to either a man-made input or a chemical-based, or maybe even another natural product, where seaweed performs best is absolutely the key marketing message that the producers will hinge on. And then the other key thing is labeling, right? So we know that there is an organic certification that can be obtained by the USDA for seaweed. We know that globally there are some entities trying to establish the safety protocols for seaweed cultivation and harvesting and processing. That will all come along eventually, but there really aren't many or any well-known labeling schemes that consumers can relate to for a seaweed product right now. So organic remains among the most important messages that you can use. Again, this is the most robust part of the report, and there's a lot more detail in this section, but this was clearly where most of the conversation hinged on with the producers, was what is the messages that you're saying about your product, about seaweed in general, that is really resonating with the customer base. Let's break there in case there are any questions.
Anyone have any questions?
Okay, we'll just keep moving. So sales channels, this is the other big issue. Who are people selling to? What channels are they relying on? Are they multi-channel? Most of them are multi-channel, as you would expect. But it all starts with having an online presence where you can either direct traffic towards purchasing from your own website. So this would be more typical, of course, of the smaller producers that are able to fulfill orders as they come in, or they're using a third-party order fulfillment, or that they could direct their customers to another online selling platform like Shopify, Amazon, etc. I will note that each of the producers suggested that it was very difficult working with some of those third-party sellers. So it's one of those situations where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? You rely on them, you need to be present there, but they are very difficult for some, especially, again, smaller producers to deal with. Probably most producers that we talked to came into this sector with a vision that one day they would be selling their products in Whole Foods or a notable retailer, right? And a lot of people get into this business not coming from that particular background, let's say consumer product goods specifically. For those that don't know, or those that do know, you could confirm that is a brutal sales channel to service. I've done that in the past with some of my own products. And what usually happens is that producers are unaware of the volume commitments, so the minimum volume guarantees that they need to make. They're usually unaware of the very strict delivery terms. You have to deliver to X warehouse in X state, and it better be there at this time frame. Otherwise, you're going to be penalized. And then from a cash flow perspective, again, especially for a smaller producer, this becomes very difficult because you're working on selling terms that require you to cover the working capital for 90 to 120 days. And a lot of producers aren't prepared for that. So while it's this dream to hit those retail sales channels, and many producers have done that successfully, it's also very difficult and requires the type of effort that you may not envision when you're beginning this process. We also found that a lot of people went to their local farmers markets, and this isn't necessarily as a sales channel because it's such a small play, but what it does do effectively is get products into the hands of consumers. It allows them to touch and feel and taste and all those things that are critical drivers of that consumer deciding to make that purchase or not. And so they're not they can be time consuming. You can end up spending more money than you make for sure, but farmers markets was a selling channel that a lot of people sort of tried in the beginning. And then finally, food service. Food service, like retail, holds great potential because of the scale, but also like retail, it's very difficult to service, especially when you start talking about volumes. We are starting to see some evidence, and some of you may already know or be directly involved with some products going into school cafeterias. That's happening with some products being done through Atlantic Sea Farms and others. One of the things that people said is that channel is very black and white. There's not really this opportunity to tell the story of seaweed like there would be if you're selling direct to consumers or through retail. It's not to say that it's a commodity, but you're talking about a large volume product that has moved into channels and markets where people aren't really looking at things like labeling or even origin for that matter. It's a food product that's going into catering, something like that, and it's not quite going to get the attention that it might in other markets. So these are the most typical sales channels that people are selling into. Clearly, retail and food service are a little more difficult than doing direct to consumer sales, but that is the goal if you're trying to get to scale and volume. So I see a couple things in the chat. Maybe I'll pause if there are any questions.
Yes. So the question was if there are any specific seaweed products already in the US market that you would highlight.
Oh, there are a lot. They run the spectrum from food products, which even within food products, there's a lot of different types, which include snack foods. So like similar to a potato chip, but made from seaweed. There are drinks, alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks that have different species of seaweed in there, whether it's sea moss or even here in the Bay Area where I am, there's somebody wild harvesting kombu, I believe it is, and including it in a gin. There are cosmetics, whether they be facial creams or other moisturizing, because seaweed has this, excellent, moisture keeping capabilities. There is everything from, again, I'm talking about available in the market, right? There are biostimulants for fertilizer, already available in at your local hardware store or local nursery. We're seeing now in major industrial applications with feed for cows and pigs. Again, that's an efficacy play right there because you're not only reducing the methane emissions from those animals, but there's also some gut health properties. Some of you may be very familiar with the new plastic alternatives with flexible plastic. There's 3 or 4 companies globally that are producing that. So all these products are available on the market right now. We tried to talk to all those different producers. We weren't successful in getting all of them to give to give feedback. But a future study would be to drill down into some of those product segments, actually. But there are many products available now. Availability is kind of a challenge. You have to go to sort of higher end grocery stores, if you will, to find a variety of seaweed products to eat. But certainly online, all of these things are accessible and through those channels that I mentioned there.
And of these new products, or of the products you mentioned, which are the newest, and like how are they marketed?
So food is probably the oldest. Let's start with that. And cosmetic applications are also, when I say old, I mean they've been around for more than a decade, right? So whether that's in a shampoo or a lotion, now you're starting to see a lot of emphasis in what's called blue beauty. But in fact, seaweed's been a part of that for a while. You all know about the red seaweeds that are harvested for, and then we use agar, or carrageenan as an input into things like toothpaste and other binding agents. Some of the newest stuff, though, to answer the question more directly, is what you're seeing in the new plastics and materials, biomaterials that are being developed in seaweed. So everything from paper to flexible plastics, you're seeing it used as an input into, spun with yarn into textiles so that you can actually produce a t-shirt with seaweed fiber. Those fibers are also being used in other applications like furniture. There's somebody making, light chandeliers out of it. So I think what's happening is as more people look at seaweed as a biomass that can be transformed into various applications and relying on various properties, you're starting to see more innovation come in. And that's exactly what we want to see. We want to see seaweed treated as a biomass that could be an alternative even to already what are considered safe plant land-based agriculture alternatives, right? So really there's huge upside opportunities, and you're starting to see that innovation. We just want to see it happen faster.
Sure. And then the last question before you move on is, of these products, do you have a sense of how many are manufactured domestically in the US?
So all of the US producers we talk to are making their product in the US. In some cases, they will import the raw material. So the type of nori or jim, that seaweed that comes from Asia, sometimes that is imported and then reprocessed here in the US. But most of the producers we talk to were using US based seaweed.
Perfect. If there's no other questions, go ahead and continue with the presentation.
Okay. Great questions. Keep them coming. All right, so what kind of activities are producers doing to actually drive their sales? So I already talked about this idea of sampling, whether it be at a farmer's market. One company was able to do it at a sporting event. So if you can get your product where there's a mass audience, again, going back to what I said about the origins of our nonprofit and this low consumer awareness, there just is not the knowledge to drive the demand for all these various products that I just discussed. It's still a very niche product. Until you can get it into people's hands, they're really not going to find it. Otherwise, they might see it in their socials, but it's not something that they're seeking out, right? The best way to overcome that is through sampling. Now, sampling is very expensive and hard to find that sort of critical mass of people where you can do that. But that has been one of the most effective ways for producers to do that, especially with food products, because people are fairly reluctant to spend, $10 on a food item that they don't know if it's going to taste good or not. But if you're sampling it right there, that's extremely effective way to do it. Another very effective thing in the food space is partnering with a chef or even a restaurant locally and giving them the product to turn into a recipe or a dish. That's happening a lot already. And I think if you're going to come in the food space, you have to have that, because you need the knowledge of those chefs that know how to work with the product. And we're seeing that especially on the coast. So in the Pacific Northwest, they have an event there that takes place. Obviously in Maine, they've got Seaweed Week, and the East Coast has been working with seaweed in their diets for a long time. But that is one of the ways, if you're doing a food product, that you absolutely will benefit from. Advocacy, we all know as we follow seaweed of all of its multiple benefits, whether you're talking in the climate space, whether you're talking about the nutrition space, as I talked about before, we know that the multi benefits. So doing advocacy in those sort of specific areas has been proven pretty effective. So, one of the plastic producers, for example, they're very, very visible in the climate tech space. They're not as visible in just the mass market, right? And so you see them not only talking about their product, but talking about the importance of climate tech. So doing different types of advocacy, or in the case of Maine, we know that seaweed farming is a huge contributor to economic livelihoods, right? That's one of the reasons it came about. And so advocating for, coastal resilience, economic resilience is a huge way to also promote your product and what you're doing as well. Another thing, as I keep saying, there's this low awareness. The vendors that are selling your products, you need to educate them on how to sell their product, or if they get a question. I love the example that my co-founder shared with me, which is in Oregon. Some of you may know they're selling tank-based, so land-based tanks that are producing dulse, right? They're selling it actually in grocery markets as a fresh product. Those grocery stores have no idea where to put it in their store. Is it a seafood item? Is it a produce item? How long is it good for? There is so much education that needs to happen on these vendors if you want them to be an ally, a partner in selling your product, that you really have to make the time to educate them on your product. You can't just say, here's our, seaweed chip and it's better than others. You have to make the time to educate them. And then finally, participating in trade shows. And no, this is obvious. I've done hundreds of trade shows myself. And let me tell you, they can be effective, but they are expensive. They are time consuming. There's no guarantee you're going to find a buyer or a customer from them. So you have to be very strategic in using those scarce dollars in participating in trade shows. And as of now, again, it comes to this question: do I go to the Boston Seafood Show? Do I go to the Natural Products Expo? I mean, where am I spending time and money in displaying my product? Some of the people doing biostimulants are in the agriculture shows, and they might be, off in a corner of, hall number 17. So you have to be very strategic in how you're doing trade shows. You can't just look at the fact that there's going to be 1,000 people there. And so that's a great exposure. It is, but you have to be very tactical in how you do it. Now, product development, this is kind of a funny title, product development that influences your marketing approach. What we're talking about here is most people, when they're doing their product development, they're not thinking about necessarily how am I going to sell this, but they are thinking about what market am I going to service with this, and how am I going to position my product versus other. And so this was an area where there's a lot of trial and error, as you can imagine. And so we heard so many stories about companies that started a product to look one way or feel another way, and it ended up totally different after some trial and error in the marketplace, right? Now that's expensive. It's time consuming. You want to, if you're going to fail, you want to fail fast. All of these typical characteristics that come with a startup, people went through as they developed their seaweed products. And so we wanted to try to capture, what were the things what were their aha moments? So for many producers, they found that trying to enter the market with a snack food versus this center of plate concept for seaweed was much more effective. So what do we mean by that? Consumers are much more willing to spend $4 on a bag of seaweed chips or the seaweed nori sheets that we see in the marketplace now than they are to go into a freezer cabinet and pull out a burger that has kelp in it. Now, I'm not making any judgment on which product is good or whatever. In fact, the kelp burgers might be selling better than the nori sheets for all we know. But producers were pretty adamant that making it easy for a consumer to eat and try in a lower cost was a very effective approach for them, rather than going for that, hey, we want this to compete with other plant-based burgers, or we want this to be something that a chef is going to make a main meal out of. Doing something like a salsa with bull kelp, like they're doing in Alaska, seemed to be a really effective way to sort of enter the market there. And that ultimately determined what product they developed. Using natural ingredients. So this might seem obvious, but if you're making something with seaweed, you're already trying to utilize and leverage the natural aspects of that. Maybe it's an alternative to a meat product in terms of the protein. But as you're making the product, you want to make the whole thing natural. You don't want to put in a bunch of sugary substitutes or food coloring to something and then try to be, marketing your product as healthy and nutritious. Purposeful packaging. So we still are at a point where plastic is such an effective form of packaging. It's very hard to wean ourselves, but there's R&D going into it every day. I mentioned that there's some packaging with seaweed that is starting to come online. There's all kinds of other natural materials that are being put into packaging to not only as a plastic alternative to try to take some of the plastic out, but to make things compostable. And so where you can, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot by, taking this beautiful seaweed product that you made and it's natural and it's healthy, but it's just totally wrapped in plastic. It's hard to get around that right now, but some of the producers are really trying to do that. And then finally, traceability and food safety. Now we're talking about aquaculture here, right? So we all know this is a critical issue. For consumers that may not know or trust some of the products that are coming out of the ocean, they just may not have full information. this idea of traceability of your products, and making sure that the food safety, that the issue of metals or any other type of agent in the ocean that might make something, you have to understand that consumers are not as informed as all of us who work with these products day to day. So you need to absolutely make sure that in the development of your product that you're along the entire value chain, you're tracing it. You can find out where your hazard critical control points. That is a key issue in the development of your product. And then we're coming up on the last area here. So,
Hey, Mike, before the next slide, there's one
yeah,
other question. They're asking if you found these companies are doing their own product development.
both cases. They're using third parties to do it. In some cases, like a commercial kitchen, particularly when you're talking about cosmetics and some of these other formulations that biostimulants. We did find third party, but as it related to the food products, a lot of in-house.
Perfect. Cool. Thanks.
So finally, what are some of the strategies that these producers are using to improve their marketing efforts? So sourcing, I've sort of already hit on this. Being mindful of what form of seaweed you're using and where it comes from, how it's harvested. We all know that there are perfectly safe and sustainable ways to do wild harvesting, just as there are perfectly safe and sustainable ways to do either land-based or ocean farming. But you have to pick and choose in the consumer segment that you're selling into what you think might be better. And of course, these products are not apples to apples, right? But given the opportunity of having your sourcing be influential in the markets that you're serving, that's a factor. Regionality. So most companies that are startups started selling locally. So in the Pacific Northwest, farm-raised seaweed coming from that region, selling into the Seattle and Portland markets first. That was their entry point. That was very successful. There was a high appreciation from the consumers of something that's local, just as there is in other agriculture and other products. We found that once companies got to a scale where they could afford staff, once they started moving beyond the startup into a little bit more established, that they hired experienced salespeople. I can't stress enough how challenging selling into these markets can be, especially if you're a new product. Having people that come with experience and knowledge of how products are sold in those marketplaces. So for example, I keep talking about snack foods. If you're a producer in the Pacific Northwest and you want your products to be sold in New York City, you're going to have to go through these different layers of agents and distributors, the stores. You might be selling to Whole Foods and dealing with a buyer in Texas, but they're organizing orders for Iowa and Oklahoma, and you're going to have to deal with the agents that are there. So it's very complicated selling into these various sales channels. A lot of times, like any startup, you'd see the owner or the founders, driving that part at first, and that's natural. But once you get to a scale where you're servicing these markets and you need to grow your sales and you're attracting investment capital to grow those sales, you're going to need to get experienced people in there. That may seem obvious, but that's what everybody confirmed to us. And then finally, using data and market research. Again, this seems very obvious, but there's not a lot of data and market research available on seaweed markets right now. I would say that most of the market reports we've seen aren't very good, with all due respect. The data lags significantly, and it's not really reflecting trends yet. This is, again, because seaweed's still relatively new and there haven't been companies or services developed to track these particular categories, right? For example, if you want to know about fertilizers, you can look at the fertilizer market more broadly, but there's not enough data to drill down into, well, how are seaweed-based fertilizers doing? Even some of the companies have a hard time getting that information out of their customers or their agents. But again, KYC, know your customer, that's critical. A lot of producers have their own customer relationship management programs, which are critical, have been critical for them. And so again, like anything else, the more data you have, the better you're going to be able to orient your marketing approaches. So those are the 6 areas. I'd like to finish this off by talking about what we found and what producers stated as their needs going forward. Many of you may be working with these, for NOAA, Sea Grant, you might be with a foundation that's supporting seaweed. Where can you invest your dollars to help these producers, right? So industry representation is interesting. I've been involved in a lot of trade associations. I ran one in Southeast Asia, as a matter of fact. They're necessary for advocacy and promotion, but they can be challenging in terms of sort of turf battles, right? So you're already seeing across the US, particularly in Maine and Alaska, you're starting to see some of the bodies there that traditionally work with seafood are taking on seaweed in their portfolio, or you are seeing aquaculture organizations taking on seaweed as well. There is no national seaweed organization. I'm not advocating for that, but it is an absence right now. It probably will come organically, but having that industry representation to be at all those trade shows and talking about seaweed, to be in front of policymakers and talking about things like expediting the permitting process along the coast, or how to create more legislation that includes funding for seaweed as a sector. That's missing right now. And so that's really needed. And I'm sure it will come, it'll grow organically, but the more we can expedite that, the better for the industry. Funding for promotion. So right now, a lot of funding is going into research. It needs to and will continue to, but eventually it would be great to start seeing federal dollars or even state dollars starting to go more into the trade promotion side of seaweed markets. I'm biased, of course, because I run an organization that focuses on consumer awareness, but I can confirm for all of you that consumer awareness is extremely low right now. And if we want to create more demand and grow the sector, we've got to start doing more education. There are a lot of tools right now. I acknowledge that. What we are trying to work on at Seagreen Insights is how do we penetrate? How do those messages penetrate beyond just the socials? We don't have the answer exactly. We've got some ideas and approaches, but that needs to happen. More data. I don't mean to be redundant here. And I think that's starting to happen. Again, those of you that are working at the grassroots farm gate level, you have access to that data. I know you're putting it out there, but it's on the demand side, the consumer side, the market side, where we need to find ways to get better data back to producers. And then finally, on that market development, customer feedback, again, I think I've already emphasized that. Not all of these producers have the resources or know-how to obtain that type of feedback. And so the more that we can sort of democratize that data and that information, not everybody can pay $20,000 for a Nielsen market report, and that may not even do the trick for them anyway. So we are all supporting this industry. We want to see it grow. These are some things that they need, and we're all well placed to deliver that. So with that, I'm going to finish. Thanks so much for your attention and your interest in this. The report is available for download on our website for free. We hope that you read it, and we'd love it if you have any questions or even if you disagree with some of our findings in our analysis. We're happy to have that conversation as well. So I'm going to stop there. Joe, thanks again for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to take any further questions.
Yeah, Mike, that was fantastic. I really appreciate you doing that presentation. Really quick, I do see we have one more question in the chat, and definitely we'll have, if people want to speak to Mike directly, that's also good. Just raise your hand. But before we get to the questions, I actually want to just really quickly, I'm going to share the link to the Seaweed group on the Aquaculture Information Exchange, and I'm going to share my screen really quickly. I encourage y'all to click the link and follow along with me. But Mike just shared a lot of really great information, and I think raised a lot of great questions about how to drive seaweed sales in the US. So I just want to really quickly show you how you can use the group on the website to continue these conversations. As you can see, if you go to the Seaweed group, you can click this button to join the group. There's the main feed, which is great for sort of one-off posts. You can see Mike posted about the event on there. I encourage all of you to go to the members tab, which is where you can connect with other people interested in seaweed. You can just go along the column here and click the connect button. I'm already connected with everybody. And then as you can see, there are subgroups under the main seaweed group. Right now, we just have one on seaweed food safety, but I'm happy to create more groups if there are other, niche interest or specific topics that people want to get into. And then the final thing is we also have group chat functionality for the group. So with either the main feed or on this discussions tab, if you want to start a new discussion, those are all going to be public. But with the messages, that would be private to people in the group, and you don't have to be connected with them in order to have that conversation. So yeah, let me stop the share there. And then I will go ahead and let's see, Randy had a question. And actually, right before I read that, I'm also going to drop the link to the exit survey if people want to go ahead and do that. But I'll also follow up with email if you want to do that later. But Randy's question was, in connecting consumers with food safety of seaweed, do they want third-party certifications or government agency oversight or something else? And to clarify, they being consumers or perceptions that growers have of their customers.
So let me try to take the first question. I think consumers, at least in the US, they trust that any product on the store shelf is safe because it has gone through, a government process, right? FDA approvals. I saw there was a question about FDA approvals. That has to occur before these products are on the shelf. As far as what consumers are demanding, I think so I don't have a direct answer as it relates to seaweed products for that, but I can share with you what I've seen in, sort of other product categories, even beyond seaweed, is there's obviously an appreciation for any step a producer has made to ensure the safety of their product and its health and nutrition aspects, right? So if it's organic, we know that organic certification, and remember, organic certification comes in all kinds of different levels, but the consumer just looks at something organic and it kind of stops right there. So it's very similar with labeling schemes. I would say that the next closest in terms of consumer awareness is the fair trade labeling scheme. Where people understand that their coffee or the fruit that they're buying comes from a farmer that was paid a decent wage, right, for their goods. Outside of that, there seems to be a number of competing things. So the Marine Stewardship Council, and there's the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. They've obviously done a very good job as it relates to seafood products like tuna and others. But I don't know that if you were just to ask your neighbor or somebody in the grocery store, if they're familiar with what those schemes are and what that means for the product, we're not quite there yet where it's rolls off the tongue, where that level of awareness is there. So I think it's going to be very important as seaweed finds its way into more products that consumer can be assured that, first of all, it is sustainably grown or harvested. It's not something that people just went out to the coastline and, randomly took it and put it into products. There is going to have to be that formal, there's an infrastructure, there's a process to do this. And right now that remains the government is the most trusted entity to do that.
Awesome. And then the next question, given the diverse product space, can consumer education be broad-based, as in seaweeds in general, or does it need to be targeted by product group?
That's such a great question. I don't have the answer to that. We're testing that right now. But I would say from what we've seen, I think that the broad-based seaweed is sort of the way to go, only because, as we all know, seaweed has become more visible, and different groups are hanging on to it, whether it's the climate group or others, right? And so they're trying to get their message out about the importance of seaweed, as are, food producers and everybody else. And so in the short term, our thinking is that consumer education on seaweed as a biomass, that has over 12,000 species, that has 25 to 30 different commercial applications, that has these properties that allow it to grow really fast without other inputs. That's already a lot of information. So if we start drilling down into red seaweeds, brown seaweeds, green seaweeds, this species, this region, all that, I think we're going to overwhelm the consumer. I think about it this way. We're actually developing right now kind of this org chart. So think about seafood, right? And if you take seafood, you could break that down into wild and then farm seafood. And then under wild, you can break that to, finfish and shellfish and cephalopods. And then you can go over to farmed and you can say, well, that's also finfish. And all of a sudden you'd have this massive org chart before you could actually point to somebody and say, well, yeah, that's rock cod that's caught off the coast of Oregon, right? Consumers are almost at that level of education of seafood. Imagine how far you have to go for seaweed to break it down by species, by application. There's so much work to be done there. It's both exciting and overwhelming. But I think that seaweed right now needs to be done. And again, I said there are tools, right? I think it's Connecticut Sea Grant, I think, has a really good toolkit for producers to use. The question is it penetrating, right? Why is it that there's an abundance of information out there and some of these toolkits? But if I was to go outside of my office right now and ask somebody about seaweed, I'd guess that it would be pretty low awareness.
Right. And we're going to have to start wrapping up soon. I'm going to try and get to these last questions. But Mike, would you be up for starting a discussion on the seaweed group just in case anybody wanted to follow up with questions after?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'm sorry we didn't have time today to hear from all of you, because I'd love to know, what your interest in and why you're here and the organizations that you're representing. We have a lot to learn ourselves. We fully admit that. And so, Joe, I would love to start a discussion there, maybe on the market, direct more people to our study. And again, for those of you that take the time to look at our study, not only do we appreciate it, but we'd love to have your feedback. Recently, I'm sorry, I forget which state put it out, but there was a business planning guide for seaweed farms that was recently put out, a very robust document. I think our report is an excellent complement to that, because we kind of take it to the next level of once you've got that business established and once you're doing those things that guide sets you up to do, then you're going to need to look at how you actually sell your product. And I think our guide can be very useful here. It's complementary. So we'd love to have feedback on it. And we're going to do a next generation of this as well. And we've got other research topics we're willing to do. So for those of you that are funding this type of research or interested in funding this, we're ready. We've got ideas, we've got the tools. And so we're looking forward to continuing the conversation and the work.
Perfect. And it looks like Missy shared the guide in the chat. So if anybody's interested. Yeah, for as far as the last question, then I think we'll have to end it. But thoughts on the FDA level food safety standards for retailing fresh seaweed as produce? Work in progress? Question mark.
I wish I had the knowledge to answer that question, but I don't.
Yeah,
We rely on all of you to work on the regulatory side of things, right? You guys are well placed to do that. But again, I'll just stand by my comment that consumers expect the FDA to make sure that our food and other products that they regulate are safe, and I'm sure they'll find the best way to do that. Not many people are buying fresh seaweed right now, so that's probably the interesting thing is, of all the work the FDA has to do, of all the approvals they have to do, are they really going to dedicate themselves to a marketplace that's, in the thousands of pounds?
Right. And then I think we can squeeze in the one more question. Was it the producer or the consumer that viewed carbon sequestration ecosystem services are a lower driver for seaweed?
Producers that we talked to, right? So there's a very good study some of you may be familiar with that showed once consumers were aware of the ecosystem benefits from farm seaweed, they were more inclined to actually buy a seaweed product. It's a very good and recent study. But yeah, but overall, producers felt that consumers aren't paying as much attention to the climate aspects as they are. And I would use that to say that, carbon sequestration is very technical. Expecting a consumer who's just looking for a face cream or something to really enter that into their decision-making equation is really a lot to consider. Even I would venture to say that consumers are still struggling with regenerative farming as a concept. So there's a long way to go before people are really making those decisions with the climate at the forefront versus things like taste, price, is it organic, sustainable, etc. Again, lots of more exciting work for all of us to do.
Definitely. All right. Well, thanks again, Mike. This was really great. And thanks for everybody for attending. Make sure to take that exit survey if you have a few minutes, and then be on the lookout in the Seaweed group for Mike's discussion thread where you can continue this conversation with him.
Yeah. Thanks again, Joe. Thanks everybody for attending. If I didn't see your thing in the chat and answer it, Joe's got my email. Please reach out. Happy to answer any other questions.
All right. Have a great week, everybody.